What if I told you most cars never make it past 150,000 miles, yet some of the exact same cars quietly cross 300,000, even 500,000? And no, it isn't luck, it isn't special engines, and it isn't because those owners spend more money than everyone else. The real reason most cars die early has nothing to do with abuse. It has to do with something manufacturers tell every owner to trust. I've seen cars wear out early while being perfectly maintained, and others last decades longer, simply because they didn't follow the rules as written. That's because modern car manuals aren't written for longevity. They're written to look good on paper. Lower service costs, fewer visits, cleaner numbers. In this video, I'm going to show you how cars actually make it past 500,000 miles by understanding where manufacturer guidance quietly stops protecting the machine and starts protecting something else. And whatever you do, don't miss the habit 7, because it's the one almost everyone follows, and it determines how early wear really begins. Habit 1, extended oil change. 7K, 15K versus longevity-based. Most drivers follow the oil change interval printed in the owner's manual. 7,000 miles, 10,000, sometimes even 15. And on paper, that sounds reasonable. Modern engines, better oil, fewer service visits. Nothing about that feels careless. That's the safe zone. But those intervals weren't chosen because engines stopped wearing. They were chosen because longer intervals make a car look cheaper to own. Engines don't wear out because they age. They wear out because oil quietly loses its ability to protect metal, long before the interval you were told to trust. Heat breaks oil down. Short trips contaminate it. Traffic and cold starts thin it out. Once that protection weakens, metal starts touching metal. Not enough to trigger a warning light. Not enough to make noise. Just enough to wear everything a little, every mile. Independent testing has shown that extended oil intervals can increase internal engine wear by up to 40%, especially in real-world driving, city traffic, hot climates, short trips. That's why engines that follow the manual perfectly still end up sludged, noisy, and tired by 120,000 to 150,000 miles. Nothing failed. They were simply worn down early. And this is why so many owners say, "I did everything right." They did, according to the schedule they were given. The damage stays invisible because it happens slowly. No alerts, no symptoms, just protection fading long before replacement. Once oil has been heat cycled that long, there's no reversing the wear that's already happened. That's the line you don't cross if longevity is the goal. If you want an engine that can push past 300,000, 400,000, even 500,000 miles, the interval has to be set for how oil actually degrades, not how a maintenance chart looks. That means shortening the interval, roughly 3,000 miles for conventional oil, around 5,000 miles for high-quality synthetic, sooner in heat, traffic, or short trip driving. It does not protect you from what happens when oil is left in too long. Shorter oil changes, the manual tells you what oil to use, don't prevent failures. They prevent wear from ever becoming a failure. Even when people start changing oil earlier, many engines still wear out fast. And the reason has nothing to do with how often the oil is changed. It comes down to what that oil actually does once the engine is under real load. Habit 2. Oil specs listed without real-world consequence. Context. Most owners' manuals list an oil specification and move on. 0W20, 5W30, synthetic recommended. And for most drivers, that feels like enough. Pick the number. Pour it in. Done. That's the safe zone. What the manual doesn't explain is why that oil was chosen, or what happens when real-world driving doesn't match the conditions it was designed around. Oil specs are often selected to meet fuel economy targets, emissions standards, and cold start efficiency, not maximum wear protection under heat, load, or age. In real life, engines don't see average conditions. They see traffic, short trips, heat soak, cold starts, high mileage. And under those conditions, oil that meets the spec can still be marginal for long-term protection. The engine doesn't fail immediately, it just runs thinner protection than it should, quietly increasing wear on bearings, timing components, and cam surfaces. That's why two engines using the correct oil can age very differently. The damage stays invisible because nothing breaks, no warning lights, no noises, just accelerated wear over time. Once that wear has happened, changing oil later doesn't undo it. That's the line you don't cross if longevity is the goal. If you want an engine that can reach 300,000, 400,000, even 500,000 miles, the oil spec has to be treated as a starting point, not the full answer. Climate, driving style, and engine age all matter, even when the oil technically meets the manual. The manual tells you what passes the test. It doesn't explain what happens when conditions stop being ideal. And this habit often explains why engines that were maintained correctly still wear out far earlier than expected. Even drivers who follow the oil label perfectly still end up with multiple systems failing together. That doesn't happen because of one mistake. It happens because entire systems were never meant to be serviced early. Habit 3. Long, service-free ownership. Schedules. Modern cars are often sold as low maintenance or even service-free for long stretches of ownership. The manual reinforces it, the brochure celebrates it, and on paper, that sounds like progress. Fewer service visits, lower ownership costs, a car that just runs, but no mechanical system is service-free. What changes is when the cost shows up. Long service schedules don't remove maintenance, they delay it. Fluids still degrade, seals still harden, particles still circulate. The difference is that the wear happens quietly, in the background, while everything still feels normal. That's why cars can go years without attention and still seem fine, right up until multiple systems start failing close together. Nothing broke suddenly. Everything just aged at the same time. Long, service-free schedules are designed to make early ownership look effortless. They reduce scheduled visits. They keep maintenance charts clean. They are not designed to maximize how long the car can last. Once wear stacks up across multiple systems, there's no single fix. That's the line you don't cross if longevity is the goal. If you want a car that can reach 300,000, 400,000, even 500,000 miles, maintenance can't be treated as something you avoid. It has to be something you stay ahead of. The manual tells you how to minimize attention early. It doesn't protect you from what accumulates later. And this habit alone explains why so many cars feel fine for years, and then suddenly become expensive all at once. The most expensive damage doesn't come from the services you skip. It comes from the ones the manual barely talks about at all. Because fluids that aren't emphasized are the ones that quietly destroy components first. Habit 4. Fluid flush delays. Some fluids aren't stretched in the manual. They're barely mentioned at all. No clear interval, no urgency. Sometimes just a vague inspection note. And for most owners, silence feels like safety. If it mattered, it would be listed. If it was urgent, they'd say so. But fluids don't wait for instructions. They age, whether they're mentioned or not. Brake fluid absorbs moisture. Power steering fluid shears down. Differential fluid fills with metal particles. And when the manual stays quiet, those fluids stay in far longer than they should. The damage doesn't show up as a failure. It shows up as corrosion, heat buildup, seal wear, and sluggish response. Quiet changes that feel like normal aging. That's why cars can drive for years with contaminated fluids and then suddenly need multiple expensive repairs at once. Nothing broke suddenly. Everything was wearing quietly together. Once corrosion and wear have set in across those systems, flushing later doesn't reverse it. That's the line you don't cross if longevity is the goal. If you want a car that can survive 300,000, 400,000, even 500,000 miles, fluid service can't depend on what's emphasized. It has to account for what's left unsaid. The manual tells you what's required to keep the car acceptable. It doesn't protect you from what degrades when no one is watching. And this habit explains why so many cars feel fine for years, right up until several systems start failing, back to back. Once those fluids start breaking down, the engine begins compensating in ways you can't hear or feel at first. And that compensation slowly overloads parts most drivers never think to check early. Habit 5. Spark plug interval stretching. Many modern cars advertise 100,000-mile spark plugs, and the manual reinforces it. On paper, that sounds like progress. Better materials, less maintenance. One more thing owners don't have to worry about. But spark plugs don't fail all at once. They weaken gradually. Modern engines fire their plugs thousands of times every minute. And as that spark degrades, combustion becomes less efficient. Long before a misfire code ever appears, fuel doesn't burn cleanly, power drops slightly, and heat starts building where it shouldn't. That extra heat doesn't just affect the plug, it overloads coils. It stresses pistons, and it slowly cooks the catalytic converter, one of the most expensive parts on the car. That's why engines can lose up to 30% fuel efficiency and still run fine until the damage reaches something that can't tolerate it anymore. The problem with stretched intervals is that they assume perfect conditions: clean fuel, easy driving, minimal cold starts. Real-world driving never looks like that. Once plugs have degraded that far, the wear they cause doesn't reverse. That's the line you don't cross if longevity is the goal. If you want an engine that can push past 300,000, 400,000, even 500,000 miles, spark plugs need to be treated as a wear item, not a lifetime promise. Checked around 40,000 miles, replaced early with OEM-grade plugs, no shortcuts, no knockoffs. The manual tells you the maximum a plug might survive. It doesn't protect you from what happens as it slowly stops doing its job. And this habit alone often decides whether an engine ages gracefully or quietly damages the parts around it. Even with clean combustion, engines still fail under load when something else starts restricting flow. And when that restriction goes unnoticed, the most expensive part in the fuel system takes the hit. Habit 6. Fuel filter, omission or de-emphasis. The fuel filter is one of the smallest parts in your car, and it's one of the easiest to forget. Many manuals barely mention it. Some don't list a clear interval at all. And on paper, that makes sense. Modern fuel systems, cleaner gas, fewer service items. But fuel filters don't fail dramatically. They clog slowly. Every mile, tiny particles from the tank, rust, dirt, sediment, get trapped inside the filter. And over time, flow drops just enough to strain everything downstream. The engine doesn't starve outright, it just struggles under load. Hesitation on acceleration, loss of power on hills, that something feels off moment. Because when fuel can't flow freely, the fuel pump works harder to compensate, and that extra strain turns a cheap, forgotten filter into a $600 to $1,200 fuel pump failure. That's why cars with clogged filters often don't throw codes. Nothing breaks. The system just wears itself out, trying to push fuel through a restriction. Once the pump overheats from that strain, there's no undoing it. That's the line you don't cross if longevity is the goal. If you want a car that can reach 300,000, 400,000, even 500,000 miles, the fuel filter can't be treated as optional or invisible. Roughly every 30,000 to 50,000 miles, sooner in dusty conditions or older vehicles, a small part, changed early, that protects injectors, pumps, and engines from thousands in damage. The manual doesn't emphasize it because it doesn't fail on schedule, but neglecting it quietly shortens everything else. Fuel problems usually give warnings. Cooling problems don't, and one small, common top-off mistake can turn a healthy engine into a failure before the temperature gauge ever tells you anything. Habit 7. Wrong coolant and coolant mixing. Coolant mixing doesn't destroy engines slowly. It destroys systems immediately. This isn't about old coolant, it's about incompatible chemistry. Most drivers assume coolant is interchangeable. Green, red, orange, yellow, it all looks the same. And when the manual doesn't clearly explain the difference, topping off feels harmless. That's the safe zone. But modern coolants are chemically engineered to work only with specific metals, seals, and additives. When incompatible types are mixed, they don't blend, they react. The result isn't gradual wear, it's sludge formation, gel-like deposits, and blocked cooling passages, sometimes within weeks. I've seen radiators turn into jelly, water pumps seize, thermostats stick shut. Not because the coolant was old, but because the wrong chemistry was introduced. Once that reaction starts, flushing later doesn't reverse it. The deposits stay, the passages stay restricted. That's the line you don't cross if longevity is the goal. If you want an engine that can survive 300,000, 400,000, even 500,000 miles, coolant replacement isn't just about timing, it's about precision. Only the exact coolant type specified. No improvising, no emergency mixing, no, it'll be fine. The manual lists the coolant type, but it rarely explains what happens when you get it wrong. And this habit is why some engines fail suddenly after a simple top-off. Even though they were running perfectly, the day before. Sudden failures get blamed on bad luck, but slow drivetrain failures get blamed on age. That's why one system quietly fails in cars that were otherwise running perfectly for years. Habit 8. Lifetime. Transmission fluid. Most drivers never think about their transmission fluid. There's no dipstick, no reminder light, and the manual often calls it lifetime. And on paper, that sounds reassuring. Sealed system. Modern engineering. One less thing to worry about. That's the safe zone. But in the real world, lifetime doesn't mean forever. It means long enough. Long enough to clear the warranty window. Long enough to keep service schedules short. Long enough to avoid uncomfortable conversations. What actually kills transmissions isn't sudden failure. It's heat. Automatic transmissions operate in extreme temperatures, and every time that fluid overheats, it breaks down a little more. Once it does, it stops cushioning clutches and gears and starts carrying microscopic debris. At that point, the fluid doesn't protect anymore. It grinds. That's why the majority of transmission failures aren't caused by broken parts, but by overheated, degraded fluid that was never replaced because it was labeled lifetime. The damage stays invisible. Shifts feel fine. The fluid still looks red. Until one day, it doesn't. By the time slipping or jerking shows up, you're no longer maintaining, and you're pricing a $4,000 to $7,000 rebuild. That's the line you don't cross if longevity is the goal. If you want a transmission that can survive 300,000, 400,000, even 500,000 miles, the fluid has to be changed before it becomes abrasive. Roughly every 30,000 to 60,000 miles, depending on heat, traffic, and load. Always with the exact fluid specified. No experiments. The manual calls it lifetime. Reality calls it consumable. And this one habit often decides whether a transmission quietly lasts decades or fails suddenly when everything seemed fine. And when overheating finally happens, it feels random, like it came out of nowhere. But in reality, it's been building silently for years while everything still looked normal. Habit 9. Stretched or vague coolant replacement intervals. Most drivers never touch their coolant until something goes wrong. The manual says 100,000 miles, sometimes longer, and on paper that sounds reassuring. Long life coolant, modern material, one less system to worry about. But coolant doesn't fail suddenly. It degrades quietly. Over time, coolant turns acidic. It loses its corrosion inhibitors, and instead of protecting metal, it starts attacking it from the inside out. That damage doesn't show up as steam or overheating at first. It shows up as slow internal corrosion, weakened gaskets, and pitted aluminum surfaces. Studies have shown that neglected coolant can increase the risk of head gasket failure by nearly 40%, long before the temperature gauge ever moves. That's why engines that never overheated still end up with warped heads, leaking gaskets, or failed water pump. Nothing failed suddenly. The protection just expired early. The reason this catches people off guard is simple. Coolant can look fine long after it stopped doing its job. Once corrosion has started, flushing later doesn't undo the damage. That's the line you don't cross if longevity is the goal. If you want an engine that can survive 300,000, 400,000, even 500,000 miles, coolant has to be treated as a consumable, not a lifetime fill. Roughly every 30,000 to 50,000 miles, depending on heat, age, and driving condition. Always the exact type specified. Mixing formulas is where real damage begins. The manual tells you when coolant becomes inconvenient. It doesn't protect you from when it becomes destructive. And this habit alone often decides whether an engine dies suddenly from overheating or quietly keeps going for decades. Most cars don't fail because they were badly built. They fail because they were maintained exactly the way they were told to. The manual does its job. It keeps the car affordable, compliant, and problem-free, long enough to feel reliable. Longevity was never the goal. Survival past the warranty was. Everything you've just seen isn't about abusing your car less. It's about maintaining it for the life you expect it to have, not the life it was optimized to sell. That's the difference between a car that feels fine for 120,000 miles and one that quietly crosses 300,000, 400,000, even 500,000 without drama. If even one habit here made you rethink how you treat your car, hit like. It tells the algorithm this information matters. Subscribe if you want maintenance that's built for ownership, not resale cycles. and drop a comment with your current mileage, not the goal mileage. The real one, because the way you maintain a car tells the story of how long you expect it to live.